Hello, YouTube. This is Mahadeva, the Thunder Wizard, and I'm going to continue reading my book, Awakening Sleipnir. We've had 3 live readings of it, and it's a lengthy book, so it takes me a while. Let me just put this in here. This is a live reading of my book, Awakening Sleipnir. And so if there are people and they want to, we can do a live Q&A after I've read some more of the book. Looks like it's going to take a while before we get through the whole thing. All right, so let me bring it up. All right, so for those of you just tuning in, watch the first 3 installments of this, and we'll just keep going. My intention when I was writing this book was I thought I was going to be writing one book, and what was a bunch of introductory information ended up taking up a whole book by itself. So I just called that Awakening Sleipnir instead of what I was going to call the whole thing, which was Mounting Sleipnir. So Mounting Sleipnir is comes after that, and we'll do live readings of that also. And Sleipnir, if you don't know, is the horse of Odin, who actually is the 8 worlds, or excuse me, 8-legged horse of Odin, which actually is the 9 worlds. So if you look at, where do I have it here? If you look at, let's see, let's hope I have what I'm looking for in here. If you look at the Thunder Wheel, Medicine Wheel, is that what I want? Well, you can look at that. You can see the 9 worlds there in that Eyjolfur in the bottom right of that picture there. So those 8 limbs that go off in all directions, those are the 8 legs of Sleipnir. And Odin would be in the middle, and he sits on top of Sleipnir, which means that the 8 legs of Sleipnir allow him to have access to all of the 9 worlds. He's sits in the center in Middle Earth, just as we do, because he represents us. He represents the highest expression of us. And the legs of the horse go out in all 8 directions. Right? So there you go. That's why I chose that name, Mounting Sleipnir, because I'm talking about my understanding of shamanism. Anyway, let's go ahead and get in the book. This is Awakening Sleipnir, Part 4. I'm just going to go ahead and start reading with the chapter called Modern European Ancestry, which is on page 69, the bottom of 69 in my PDF version, which may be different than yours. So, here we go. Modern European Ancestry. Western-style academia does not teach us about our European ancestry before the so-called Dark Ages. This is the period of history where post-Roman imperial Christianity was firmly taking hold. European history classes in our schools and universities are called Western civilization. These history classes start with the origins of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Then they trace the history of Western civilization into Greece and then Rome, and then suddenly European Christians magically sprout out of the ground sometime around 400 AD, as though they are a direct extension of the Greeks and Romans. I wrote about this subject in my first book, The Thunder Wizard Path, but I mention it again here because I think it is so very important for modern Westerners to have a deeper sense of history than what is currently taught. In China, Africa, India, Israel, Egypt, and many more places in the world, if one were to ask anyone from these countries about their ancestry, they would be able to go back thousands of years and recount a rich history of their people and cultures. However, when we ask any Westerner of European descent about their ancestry, the farthest anyone can go is to the Dark Ages, when Christianity was replacing polytheism in Europe. Or they might even go back and say, oh yeah, our origins are with the Greeks or the Romans. But That's not the case with Northwestern Europeans. Our modern sense of self mysteriously vanishes if we attempt to go back any further into our history, or worse yet, is somehow magically transported to Mesopotamia or the mythology of the biblical Middle East. I recently saw a movie that was made this past year concerning life in the pre-Christian British Isles. In that film, the Roman occupiers were well groomed, their clothes were made well, and overall had a nice appearance. However, once the Roman protagonists crossed north of Hadrian's Wall into the territory of the barbarian Pictish tribes, which would be in modern-day Scotland, every person they encountered was dressed in rags and lived in horrendous filth. The indigenous British were depicted unkempt and dirty. Apparently, only the advanced culture of Rome taught people how to make clothing correctly, to shave and cut their hair. Apparently, only the Romans knew how to smelt metal, ride horses, make shoes, and bathe. While this was only a film, I find it to be very accurate in terms of our modern unconscious presumption concerning our pre-Christian European ancestors. And I realize that this stereotype is imprinted onto the unconscious of all children in Western churches and schools. Since it was the Roman culture that imported Christianity to Europe, the pagan peoples of Europe were re-educated by their Roman and Christian conquerors to identify with Roman Christianity and culture to such an extent that now, 1,000 years later, when we think or speak about pre-Christian Northern European people, we speak about them in the third person and call them barbarians, as if we are the Roman conquerors bringing the light of civilization to those pitiful backward primitives. I found it especially striking to me that this same attitude that we moderners and the Roman conquerors had toward our pre-Christian polytheist ancestors is the exact same attitude that Westerners had toward the indigenous peoples of the Americas. One of the main justifications for European conquest of Native Americans was that European Christians were bringing the light of the gospel to the degenerate savages. The unconscious message is that even if Europeans were enslaving and brutalizing them, at least the poor degenerate savages would have the chance to convert to the one true religion and go to heaven after death, whereas if they were allowed to keep their dignity and freedom, they would die and spend an eternity in hell. The hatred that European settlers displayed toward Native Americans is the same attitude that we white people have towards ourselves on an unconscious level, and it is the same attitude that Western Christians had toward every non-European, non-Christian culture. Many readers may know that when Spaniards first encountered Native Americans, there was a controversy in the Catholic Church as to whether or not these native peoples were even human. Many European colonists wanted to enslave the native peoples, but they couldn't legally do so if the church determined that the natives possessed eternal souls. So if the argument could be made that these people were not human, then they did not possess eternal souls and could be therefore made into slaves and treated as any other animal. This actually went on. I mean, so-called Christians sat there and debated whether or not Native Americans had souls or not. The Christian Bible taught that Jesus died for the salvation of the souls of all people on earth. So why the controversy among Christian Europeans over the humanity of the natives? It is my firm belief that this attitude was a direct extension and projection of the dehumanizing visited upon the pre-Christian polytheist cultures of Northern Europe at the hands of the Romans and later the Romanized Christian culture. Furthermore, sadly and ironically, it was this re-education that created the deep self-hatred within the European psyche that replayed itself in the racism and genocide of the European conquest of the Americas. When Christianity replaced the 50,000 years of the European animist and polytheist identity, it eradicated any sense of ancestral history before the Roman conquest of Europe, and this rewriting of ethnic European history continues to this day in our Western educational systems. In high school and university, I learned far more about the religion of Egypt and Mesopotamia than I did about the religion of my own ancestors. In fact, as I think back, I don't believe I was taught anything in school about pre-Christian Northern European polytheism. It is likely I learned something about the Vikings, but I don't remember that. I do remember being taught about Mesopotamian religion, however. While Mesopotamian history is very interesting, it is only pertinent to the history of pre-Christian. It is only pertinent to the history of pre-Christian European civilization if one wishes to chronicle the introduction of the imperial mindset into world history. Perhaps this is why Western civilization courses start with the rise of Mesopotamian city-state empires rather than with the pre-Christian tribal polytheists of Northern Europe. The fact that our Western sense of history starts with the invention of imperialism reveals our personal histories as modern creatures of empires. While facilitating an acting seminar many years ago, I was leading students in an acting exercise to imagine themselves living in a tribal environment away from modern technology. The purpose was to help the actors move into a more spontaneous, intuitive bodily connection to increase the sense of the emotional connection to bodily responses and vice versa. My theory was that our ancestors who lived a more primitive lifestyle had to have a more immediate intuitive connection to their environment through their bodies and emotions in order to better translate these emotions into practical action for survival purposes. As an actor, I found that strengthening this connection translated into more authentic performances because the actor was more able to translate their feelings into actions instead of over-intellectualizing their feelings, which is what many new actors tend to do. It was my contention, and still is, that while technological advances have helped us to survive, we have as a result become disconnected from our physical, intuitive interaction with reality and have retreated into an ever more arbitrary intellectual world where we believe that we have the luxury to repress or even deny emotional responses. People who live a life directly exposed to the natural elements do not have this luxury. In an attempt to help create an imaginary scenario and help relate this to the mostly European Americans in attendance, I began speaking about the pre-Christian Druids and made the offhand statement, our pre-Christian European ancestors lived a lifestyle very similar to that of Native Americans in many respects. At which point, a young man of European descent, whom I will call Troy, said, I take offense at that remark. In his defense, he did not say this with anger, but seemed to be as confused by his outburst as the rest of us, but he just couldn't stay silent with his emotional response to my statement. Perhaps it was the nature of the seminar that reduced his defenses. I believe under other circumstances, Troy's defense mechanisms would have repressed or denied this reaction. As soon as he said this, there was an uncomfortable pause as he and everyone listening realized the racist implication of his comment. After a brief moment of uncomfortability shared by all, I chose to move on without addressing his comment. Upon reflection now, I wish I had explored Troy's response with him and the class in a non-judgmental fashion. Sigh. Hindsight. Troy was a young adult from a rural, very conservative, fundamentalist Christian part of the USA, Idaho, as it turns out. So I believe it is very likely that his inaccurate personal ancestral history was a result of his insulated conservative Christian upbringing and education. It probably didn't help that he lived in, that part of the country where, there still was Native American reservations, that people knew of. I honestly don't know. So I believe it is very likely that his inaccurate personal ancestral history was a result of his insulated conservative Christian upbringing and education. And I have often reflected on the naivete of his response over the years as I have heard similar views repeated over and over again over the last 20 years from the increasingly militant born-again Christian socially conservative movement that has amazingly strengthened over the last 20 plus years since that seminar. I am struck with how insulated from history one must be not to know that there was a Stone Age in Europe. Native Americans at the time of the arrival of Europeans had simply been living a Neolithic Stone Age lifestyle, similar to that of all human cultures, including Europeans. The abundance of natural resources on the American continent and the relative lack of population density simply didn't necessitate Native American populations from inventing newer technologies, not to mention city-states. Actually, I don't know that that's completely true now that I've done some more research. There was more, it looked like before the Europeans arrived that there was more of an imperial, larger culture, but that disease had gotten to what is now the continental United States long before Europeans did. And so the vast majority of Native Americans had been wiped out by disease. So, their larger culture, their more intricate, type of living wouldn't have been apparent to the guys who just showed up. Archaeologists have theorized that modern technology was the direct result of the development of large-scale farming and livestock needed to fuel large density populations in the early Mesopotamian city-states. This surplus of food resources led to the perceived need to hoard supplies, which demanded the forming of armies to protect the supplies, which created a widening of class power structures, thus creating the first large empires. It all started with people having more food and resources than necessary for short-term survival. We can observe how this same trend started in the Americas among the Toltec, Inca, and the Mayan empires, but because the geographical conditions in Central and South America were not suited to continuous large-scale farming, these Native American empires died out from lack of resources. Had the geography and climate of Central and South America supported the large-scale empires that were developing in the New World instead of in Mesopotamia, then technology would have been invented there instead. Mesopotamia was simply a much better place to become the breadbasket of history. The Toltecs and the Mayans simply ran out of natural resources, and their civilizations declined before such technological inventions were necessitated in their cultures. For Troy to find offense at this idea that his own ancestors once lived a Neolithic lifestyle revealed a personal history that did not include any of his ancestors ever living in the Stone Age. It revealed the commonly held unconscious personal ancestral history that begins no earlier than Christian medieval Europe. We see this warped understanding of European cultural history in the large numbers of fundamentalist Christians who adamantly seek to teach the 7-day creationist theory to children in public science classes, even in light of copious and irrefutable scientific evidence to the contrary. The level of denial needed to keep this idea that Europeans are directly descended from Adam and Eve somewhere in the Middle East a few thousand years ago is mind-boggling. Yet, I had this same personal history as a child that I have had to rewrite since I reached adulthood and was forced to confront my illogical Christian education. Since the first people who originally founded the country now known as the United States were mostly English and German immigrants, one might think that it would be equally as important to educate us on the pre-Christian ancestral roots of those first European Americans. Unless, of course, the European psyche by the time of the founding of that country had already discarded its ancestral identity to that of its extinct Roman conquerors. Is it any wonder that European Americans have tried so hard to re-educate Native Americans to discard their language and culture and replace it with Western culture? If we didn't value our own tribal, animist, ancestral heritage, why would we place value on another primitive culture that reminds us on an unconscious level of our own pre-Christian ancestors whom we have been taught to despise? Just as in that film I mentioned, Europeans have been taught to assume that their pre-Roman, pre-Christian ancestors were subhuman barbarians, and in our collective psyches we are taught to believe that Europeans did not become human until after Europe converted to Christianity. Of course, that's not verbally stated, but that is definitely the message. And think about it. Anybody who's gone, and taken history courses, at any point in time did you feel like you resonated with the Vikings or any, if they mentioned anybody before the Middle Ages? And did you find yourself feeling associated with the Greeks when they talked about Greeks and Greek civilization and Romans? Just think about that. Just ask yourself that question. All right. In fact, when we speak in historical terms about pre-Christian Europeans, we often speak about them in the third person as though they are foreign to us. This unconscious self-hatred, in my opinion, is the cause for much of the racist tendencies of Westerners over the past 500 plus years. I also believe that this imposed hatred of the earth that Christians use to eradicate the pagan religions of Europe is the primary cause of our current ecological battles with pollution and global warming. Our European ancestors worshipped the earth. Today we are taught that she, our mother, is just a lifeless rock containing valuable resources we can take without any consequences. I could go on, but you get my point. Our natural ancestral connection to the earth for the last 50,000 years in Europe was one of deep respect. If we want to be true to our ancestors, we need to respect and honor the mother of us all, the goddess named Earth. If we want to regain a true sense of self-respect, we can start by changing our understanding of who we are and where we come from. Next chapter, Mother Earth. Possibly the most notable difference in thought between modern Westerners and our pre-Christian animist ancestors is our attitude and relationship to the earth and nature. Moderners see themselves as separate from the earth, whereas our tribal Germanic ancestors saw themselves as inseparable from her. Today, most people seek to live in large cities. City living is a foundation of all empirical societies. The Roman historian Tacitus notes that the traditional tribal Germanic lifestyle in 98 AD was in sharp contrast to the Roman style, where he notes, quote, "It is well known that the nations of Germany have not cities, and that they do not even tolerate closely contiguous dwellings. They live scattered and apart, just as a spring, a meadow, or a wood has attracted them. Their village they do not arrange in our fashion, with the buildings connected and joined together, but every person surrounds his dwelling with an open space." Unquote. If one were to replace the word Germany in this quote with the name of any other primitive tribal culture, it would fit perfectly. What Tacitus is saying here is that the pre-Roman Germanic people were no different than any other aboriginal tribal people who lived in harmony with their natural surroundings. So, since we're doing this live, why don't I try that? I will see, I'll just change the word of Germany to, what should we say? Amazon tribes. It is well known that the Amazon tribes have not cities, and that they do not even tolerate closely contiguous dwellings. They live scattered and apart, just as a spring, a meadow, or a wood has attracted them. Their village they do not arrange in our fashion, with the buildings connected and joined together, but every person surrounds his dwelling with an open space. See? Exact same thing. If one were to... Oh, I already said that part. And yet, the modern stereotype of someone of Germanic descent is the opposite. Modern Caucasians are universally seen as people completely out of touch with nature and dependent on modern technology to survive. Unfortunately, in many cases, I have to agree. But as with any racist generalization, this is not true in all cases, nor does it represent our essence, but rather the choices we have made. Recently, I watched a documentary about a rash of grizzly bear attacks on campers in Glacier National Park during the 1960s. One of the interviewees present during that tragedy was a Native American man who said, "These white people don't know how to interact with bears." As someone of European descent who has spent a lot of time in the wilderness dealing with wild bears and successfully avoiding them, while keeping my food hidden from them, I was immediately offended at the racist generalization in that remark. But in the case of those campers, his remark was absolutely true, and I would have to agree that many average white people have no clue how to deal with wild animals as a result of living in urban and suburban communities. From the personal experience of this native man, white people were so disconnected from nature that they had no idea how they had created this disaster. For decades, visitors to the park, mostly urban dwellers, had been feeding the grizzlies their uneaten food. Visitors to the lodge were encouraged to watch the bears eat the lodge's discarded food as a nightly show. This was, in fact, one of the main attractions to the backcountry lodge. This nightly show for the visitors trained the bears and their offspring to be accustomed to humans and depend on them for food. The Native American watching this could easily see the disaster in the making. His comments indicated to me that his cultural history with European Americans, combined with his personal experience with them, encouraged him to just write them all off as stupid white people. And once again, in that instance, I couldn't agree more. I contemplated on the stereotype that Europeans give to non-Westerners, which is that somehow Europeans are some alien form of life that have no history living in natural conditions. This is a false history that European culture has attempted to convey as well, which is that civilized, urban-dwelling Christian Europeans simply appeared out of thin air around the time of Charlemagne and have never been tainted with the disgrace of ever having a history of Aboriginal living. That Native American man's comment made me feel like an alien creature, but of course this is not true. So how could 50,000 years of living in harmony with nature be erased from the cultural and ethnic memory of an entire people in so short a time? European brown bears were prevalent in pre-Roman Europe, and many Germanic personal names contain the word bear. One of the totemic animals for the Teutonic people was the bear. Ozzy Osbourne's last name, Osborne, is an Old English name from pre-Christian Germanic polytheism that means divine bear or spirit bear, Os Bjorn. While Mr. Osborne himself is known for his heavy metal music, somebody in his Old English pagan past was given the spiritual totemic name of Spirit Bear. A pre-Roman Teuton would have known how to interact with wildlife. In fact, one Germanic method for storing food, according to Tacitus, was to bury food in man-made earthen caves covered over with livestock feces. Tacitus believed it was to hide the food from enemy tribes, but a more logical and practical explanation, in my opinion, is that this was done to protect the food from wild animals, perhaps bears, by masking the earth, covering it with the scent of animal waste. Yet again, I digress. So, why have people of European descent discarded their ancestral custom of living in open rural settings for that of densely packed urban settings? There are some obvious survival reasons for this, but I believe there is also a deeper spiritual reason for this. I believe the main reason that Northern Europeans adopted city living is because our post-Romanized Christian ancestors were taught to fear and hate nature instead of embracing her as they had done for over 50,000 years. I myself have never been comfortable in crowded surroundings. One of the main reasons I moved out of Southern California, apparently I wrote this when I was in Idaho. One of the main reasons I moved out of Southern California some years ago was because I did not like the extreme overstimulation of the senses caused by the megalopolis that is Southern California. That is why I spent so much time backpacking in the mountain wilderness as a young man. It wasn't just for relaxation. I had to spend at least 2 weeks every year in complete isolation in the forest, away from the sound of any motorized vehicles for the sake of my own sanity. The few years that I chose not to do so resulted in some severe anxiety. I literally needed those 2 weeks every year away from the sounds of cars just to be able to maintain my mental and emotional equilibrium in urban life for the coming year. Based on my experiences between the two extremes, I have some theories as to what happens when modern people come together to create cities and suburbs. Energetically speaking, in my experience, there is a protective psychic energy bubble created by humans that surrounds modern cities of any size. This protective bubble projects the unconscious mental and emotional states of the residents. In my experience, modern Western cities, at least here in the USA, project an animosity toward nature that I believe I can feel. When I pass a certain point where the consciousness of people does not enter, I believe I can feel an oppressive psychic weight lift off my shoulders, and suddenly I can breathe. I can remember one incident when I was driving through the Colorado Rocky Mountains. I drove to a high elevation trailhead and did some hiking in what appeared to me, from a visual standpoint, to be some very isolated wilderness. In my experience in the Sierras, I found that at high elevations I would experience a particular euphoria that I equated with the thin air of higher altitudes. However, during this particular hike in the Rockies, I did not experience this rush. I tried to figure out why this was happening. Was it because of the trees? Nope. These were my favorite kind of trees and the forest was thick. Was it because the rocks here were sedimentary instead of granite? Possibly. Granite has a different energetic property than sedimentary rock. Was it because of the elevation? Nope. I was at a pretty high elevation and the air was pretty thin, yet I felt like the area was energetically dead. From what I could tell, I was in a pretty wild part of the mountains, but the place felt domesticated or perhaps conquered. I just could not feel the spirit of the place. I realized that in my favorite areas of the Sierras, I could feel the spirits of the wilderness and they were friendly to me and gave me spiritual energy. I realized that this was happening on a very deep level, and in my conscious westernized mind, I had explained away my euphoria as merely being lightheaded from the lack of oxygen at that elevation. Well, here I was in the high Rocky Mountains, deep in the forest, and there were no mountain spirits anywhere near me, and I could feel it. If I closed my eyes, it felt like I was still in the city. The mountains in that area looked pretty, but felt energetically stagnant. Disappointed and bewildered, I hiked back to my truck and I continued driving through the mountains. Well, wouldn't you know it, a few miles down the road, a famous ritzy Colorado mountain resort town suddenly emerged from around a bend, and it all made sense. Even though that trail was technically in the wilderness, its proximity to that elite mecca of self-consciousness and excess had contaminated the spirit of that particular trail. If I were a mountain spirit, I would have vacated that part of the mountains also. My perceptions on that trail were correct, and I learned a lot about myself as a shaman that day. Those mountains in the general vicinity of that city had been domesticated. I think it was Vail, Colorado. The mountains in the general vicinity of that city had been domesticated through the psychological projections of ego and flagrant excess that often accompany people who derive their self-identity from wealth and reputation. While I take it as a matter of fact that modern Westerners seem to instinctually contaminate the wildness of nature, either through direct destruction of habitat or through the more unconscious psychic projections they radiate, our ancestors were in direct contrast to their spiritual connection to nature. According to Tacitus, the aboriginal Germanic tribes revered nature in her purest untouched form. Quote, "The Germans, however, do not consider it consistent with the grandeur of celestial beings to confine the gods within walls, or to liken them to the form of any human countenance. They consecrate woods and groves, and they apply the names of deities to the abstraction which they see only in spiritual worship." Once again, replace the word Germans with any other Aboriginal people and it fits. Let's go ahead and do it. Let's pick somewhere else. The natives of the Andaman Islands, however, do not consider it consistent with the grandeur of celestial beings to confine the gods within walls, or to liken them to the form of any human countenance. They consecrate woods and groves, and they apply the names of deities to the abstraction which they see only in spiritual worship. Works every time. Terms such as white devil and soulless monsters have been used as stereotypical slur against those of European descent. As much as I resent this racist remark when applied to myself, I cannot but wholeheartedly agree when I look at some of the actions of many of my fellows of European origin over the last 500 to 1,000 years. It is sadly ironic that the stereotype of the nature-dwelling animist Germanic peoples only 2,000 years ago were the very same people who now are stereotyped as soulless demons who devour and destroy Mother Nature. How did this 180-degree shift happen in so short a time? The answer, in my opinion, is due to the imperial colonization of Europe, followed by the spiritual colonization of Europe by the imperially crafted version of Abrahamic monotheist Christianity. After 400 plus years of Roman conquest and imperial colonization, the Northern European tribal people had been spiritually domesticated and primed for Christianization. This Christianized re-education was decidedly antagonistic toward the earth and earth-centered spirituality. As Tacitus notes, our Germanic ancestors valued the sacredness of nature to such a high degree that for our ancestors there was no need for temples or man-made images. They worshipped nature herself. For the Christian missionaries to make progress converting the native Germanic tribes, they had to re-educate them into believing that nature herself was evil. This re-education was so successful that today we can now see how antagonistic modern people are toward nature. In my experience, there is one other aspect to this apparent hatred of the natural world by the Western culture. It is intense fear. I would go on to say that this is the cause of global warming. We can stop using petroleum products. We have the technology to stop doing it. We just don't want to. We say it's because it's too difficult or too expensive. But if we chose to, we could do it. The only reason we don't do it is that there's an unconscious emotional agenda to keep destroying our attachment. We're still running off of the Christian teaching that the earth and worshiping the earth is evil and that the earth is a demon. All right. Back to the book. In my experience, one of the most powerful sources of spiritual transformation is the wildness of nature. When I have spent time alone for extended periods in wild areas, the personal and spiritual transformation has been very powerful. In my experience, the natural world is constantly bombarding us on a spiritual level to evolve. This evolution feels like death, and indeed it is. It is a death of ego. Nature is a window to the infinite. That infinity will not tolerate any kind of victim mentality. Living in nature not only requires a physical bravery to survive the elements, it also requires a spiritual bravery to allow oneself to be elevated beyond one's spiritual limitations. In order to avoid this constant attack against our limitations, one must create a protective psychic barrier against it. This is accomplished by creating cities. Cities not only provide a physical safe haven against the rigors of natural elements, but they provide an environment that is dominated by a psychic barrier to keep out the onslaught of the infinity of nature against our finite attachments. The safest way to create this bubble is to fill it with the psychic projections of greed, materialism, ego, reputation, etc. These are naturally occurring psychic projections humans already have. But if one is relatively close to their natural surroundings, nature tends to help balance these psychic projections. But when humans are packed into smaller areas, it is easier for us to mentally bolster the ego-driven projections of our neighbors, which creates a denser, protective psychic bubble. Why is it we build our homes so close to each other? Economic limitations? No. In my opinion, this is an artificial excuse to necessitate close quarters in order to strengthen the psychic barrier against the power of nature to push us towards spiritual evolution. Our ancestors sought to live in private areas surrounded by nature. They sought not to live close to each other. This makes sense if one's culture is based on the worship of nature. This makes sense if one's culture allows for the existence of deities and nature spirits who inhabit forests, lakes, mountains, and springs. This makes sense if one lives in a culture where money has not been invented, where one's wealth is not measured by the physical possessions they own. One reason I am a night owl is because when most people are asleep, I am able to allow my mind to soar unencumbered by the frantic projections of self that I sense whizzing around me during the day. When I'm in the wilderness, I have no problem going to sleep at sunset. There's no psychic chatter to keep me awake. In the city, this is different. The nighttime is the only time I can feel the silence and do my animist work in peace. In ancient times, certain areas like forests, groves, or lakes were viewed with awe and left alone out of respect. Certain lakes and forests were thought to be inhabited by awesome spirits or deities. Humans either were not allowed in those areas or they had to seek permission from the deities in order to gain safe passage through such areas. It was thought that if one were to enter such places without permission from the spirits, that people could die or be taken by the spirits, never to return. In ancient times, when passing through a sacred forest, if you fell down, you had to crawl the rest of the way out of respect for the nature deities. If you fell, it meant that the spirits of that place were humbling you. How different that mentality was than today. The strategy of our ancestors was to leave these natural areas in peace. The strategy of modern man is to conquer such places or destroy them as if their mere existence was a threat. This act of destruction against nature was a Roman imperial strategy as well. When Roman armies would invade a new territory, one of the first things they would do was locate forests or glens that were considered sacred by the people they sought to conquer. Then they would chop down that forest. This was their way of not only conquering those people, but also to conquer the gods, ancestors, and spirit allies of those they wished to dominate. After 400 plus years of these kinds of actions by the Romans, those Germanic peoples who were conquered ingested the resultant spiritual self-hatred to such a degree that now we are doing it automatically without any conscious strategy or agenda. At least the Romans were consciously employing a strategy by this kind of targeted destruction of nature. For us moderners, we seem to do it out of a mindless instinct. Is it any wonder that we are viewed by other cultures as soulless monsters who mindlessly devour natural resources without awareness or appreciation? This destruction of nature is not only aggression towards the infinity of nature, but also to our ancestors. It is an unconscious act of war against our traditional animist past. When this attack against nature was first done by those first Teutonic converts to Christianity, it was done on a conscious level to appease our Roman or Christian conquerors. But nowadays, this hatred and fear has been so deeply internalized that we have been operating from it instinctively for hundreds of years. Our Roman captors have been vanquished. There is no longer a need to seek their acceptance. The Catholic Inquisition has ended. The danger is over. Yet we still act as though we fear their sudden return to punish us if we do not destroy our sacred forests, rivers, and lakes. The reason why we are still seeking to drill for oil when we have the technology to have carbon-free energy is not because of the financial restrictions. If we as a society wanted to be free of fossil fuels, we would be. We continue to drill for oil because of the ingrained unconscious fear and hatred of Mother Nature. The reason why there is still debate over the existence and cause for global warming is not from a lack of scientific evidence, but from fear. A fear that if we were to stop our attacks on Mother Earth, that we would once again be forced to live in a world full of awe and wonder, a world that would have the power to change us spiritually and force us to evolve. Modern man, in my opinion, is merely a frightened toddler with a machine gun, ready to fire upon any possible threat to his or her safe, familiar environment. It is time for us to grow up or we will destroy ourselves. All right, let's see. I'll go ahead and stop there because then I'm going to move on into other things in the book. So I'll stop there for now and see if there are any questions. And if not, we will call it a day. So let me take a look here. All right, so Riho Rasta, question. Why do we forget things? Can you please dive as deep as you can? We live without memory and just know what we need to know when we need to know it. I don't know. I kind of have to be more specific than that. It's really kind of I guess because here's a simple answer. We only have so much RAM available in our hard drive. One of the reasons that we dream at night, one of the reasons that we sleep for 8 hours isn't because our body needs 8 hours. It's because our brain needs 8 hours. And when we sleep, we dream, and a lot of those dreams are completely, totally not remembered because it's the brain actually going through all the events of the day. And your subconscious mind remembers everything. Every single detail is recorded in there. But when we dream, the brain is looking for the important things and throws out the rest. So it's like somebody's going into your hard drive and erasing all of the data that you recorded all day and only keeping the data that's important. So I think that's one of the reasons. That's a pretty deep question, Riho. Why do we forget things? I guess we could talk about the difference between forgetting things and suppressing things. Suppressing things is done out of fear and out of a survival need. But can we live without memory and just know what we need to know when we need to know it? A lot of animals do that. So I don't know. It's a big question. I don't really have an answer, other than what I've given. But thanks for the question. Gamzer Farsi, question. What is the effect of having Ketu in Scorpio as Aruda Lagna? Depends on the house. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what your ascendant is. It depends on what other planets are aspecting it. Yeah, for me, what's more important isn't that Ketu's in Scorpio, but that what house is Ketu in. First house is identity. Second house is immediate family. Third house is communication. Fourth house is home. Fifth house is secondary education. Sixth house is enemies. Seventh house is spouse and other people. Eighth house is the unconscious mind. Ninth house is your spirituality. 10th house is your career. 11th house is your gains. 12th house is your death. So where K2 sits depends on the house. That's more important to me than the sign it's in. CRA question: is there a ritual or ceremony that will help cleanse the land to make it more pleasing for the spirits? Of course there are. Anything. Any ritual or ceremony. Any type of energy work. Go and do qigong and give energy back to the trees. Give energy back to the earth. Do the heaven earth. You can do the heaven earth qigong meditation. You can go look on my channel for that. If you don't know how to do it, figure out how to look. Again, it just drives me crazy. People don't know how to do this. You can search within somebody's channel. So learn how to search within somebody's YouTube channel. Type in Heaven Earth Qigong Meditation on my channel, and you go do that. If you do that, you'll attract spirits and let them come back. You can chant mantras. Like if you have a Vedic mantra, you can chant mantras and chant to just chant around the forest and the rocks. And the rocks actually, before the advent of phones and that kind of stuff, we had tape. We had actual tape that we recorded things onto, and it was the minerals in that tape that would record the sounds. And so people would talk about how being in caves, the caves would record the sounds that were connected into them. So anything will do the job. Okay, so that's it. I don't see any more questions. All right. So the ninth house, K2 in the ninth house. K2 in the ninth house with Scorpio says that in a previous life you were a priest and you mastered the priestly duties. You mastered ritual, you mastered spirituality, and you followed all the rules and all the regulations and all of that. And so in this lifetime, you have a natural mastery over spirituality. But because you mastered it in a previous life, you have no attachment to it. So you might not be aware. What K2 does is K2 shows you what you've mastered in a previous life, also what you have mastery over now, but you're not aware of. For instance, I've got a flute over here, a native style flute. It's just empty. I taught myself how to play flute. I didn't go and learn. I just started playing it. And you've heard the songs. Maybe some of you have heard the songs that I played, and people go, "Oh my God, it's so beautiful." And I'm like, I'm just farting around. I don't have any knowledge. Well, that's because my K2's in my fifth house, which has to do with performance, music, as well as other things. So in a past life, I must have learned how to play the flute. I don't have any attachment to it. I think it's beautiful. I enjoy doing it, but I don't care. I don't care if anybody hears it or knows that I do it. I don't care. So it means that you don't care about that, and you don't care about being a spiritual person or being seen as a spiritual person. You already are. You probably have very deep awarenesses. Probably the stuff that I teach, when I go deep, you probably nod your head and you go, yeah. Whereas somebody else goes, oh my God, I've never heard that before. You probably say things when you talk about spirituality that to you just seems normal, but is really deep for others. The eighth sign, Scorpio, is a very deep sign. So it means that you've mastered deep spirituality in a past life and you don't have an ego about it. The K2 is the tail of the snake, so the snake is still swishing his tail as he moves out of there. So you will stir things up, just like I was an actor for years, and I'm no longer an actor because K2's in my fifth house, which, that's why the acting that I did, even when I did audition for, big wigs in Hollywood, they would say, oh my God, how come we've never seen you before? I'm like, I don't know. Why don't you guys cast me? It's because K2 was saying, you've done that before. We don't need to do this. Get it out of your system and let's move on. So, David Turner, if you have a question, do me a favor, write the word question. I know it's not a big deal today, but if it's really busy, it might be. Can you see the possibility of people on a large scale moving back to loving nature? Can I see it? Yeah, I can see it. Do I predict it? I don't know. I honestly don't know. To be honest with you, at this stage in my life, I don't know where things are going. We're definitely going through a transition. I mean, I am still flabbergasted at what's happening in the United States right now. With the COVID thing, it doesn't look like it's ever going to end. And as I've said before, I'm here in Australia. New Zealand has kicked its ass, but that's because New Zealand is isolated, small population, and people don't have a problem taking direction from the government. When the government steps in and says, hey, this is for your best interest, they go, okay, and they do it. They don't like it, but they do it. And they've squashed the virus. It's gone. Australia has done a very good job and is continuing to do so. It's completely non-existent where I'm at, even though we're still following some of the protocols. But the United States can't do that. It doesn't have, number one, it's impossible to do it. But, Americans are just so paranoid about the government telling them to do anything. And they're so, we'll just leave it there. They don't like being told what to do, that, nobody's following through. And so it just, that's the worst thing. That's why it's popping up and the numbers are staying high. It's because you got to do one or the other. You either got to let everybody get sick and take the hit of people dying from it so that you get immunity, or you got to squash it. You got to starve it out through isolation. But having it half and half is just going to keep it spiking forever. And it worries me, because if the US doesn't get itself together and I end up having to leave because of visa things, I won't get to come back. And I would hate that. And I do not want to go back to the States right now. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, this has got me like, I don't know where the world's going. But I mean, you're asking me, can I see the possibility? Of course I can see it. Do I know it's going to happen? I don't know. I don't know. All right, so you don't believe in government fear-mongering propaganda? I don't believe in nonsense, fear-based, uneducated conspiracy theories by people who troll the internet and don't have an education and can't tell the difference between an actual conspiracy and one that's just made up because they've been watching too much weird crap on YouTube. It's really great that you can stout your belief like that, though. I don't believe in anything somebody says because I'm afraid of people in authority. Flat earther? Anyway, I really hate a lack of education, and I really hate fear, and I think that's one of the reasons all this stuff is going on. So anyway, this is what we're going to do here. This sort Voctor, I haven't asked for your opinion. This is a question and answer only, so we're going to put you in a timeout because I don't really give a crap about your opinion. If you watch enough of my channel, you find out I think you're full of crap. I think you're full of fear. I think that you're a child and you're afraid and you can't tell the difference between, like I said, a real conspiracy and one that's made up just to distract you. The very people you think you're fighting against are the very people who are feeding you the nonsense that you think is actual real conspiracy truth. It's time to grow up. Open a book. Get educated. Stop being such a child. Anyway, I'm putting you in a timeout because I'm not interested in that. Okay, so now it's time for me to, because you know how this works. The way this works is that, where are we going here? The way this works is that if you don't have a question, then I have to either sell you stuff or entertain you. I'm too tired to entertain you. So, lockdown.thunderwizard.com. While the lockdown is going on, I'm going to continue to give away $3,214 worth of all of my video teachings. By the way, if you're coming onto this channel and the only experience you have with this channel is just watching a few videos, you're getting basically nothing from what I teach. I'm reading this book because the books are important, but the most important thing are the practices. Just coming on here and wanting to talk about this and listening to me talk about that is interesting, but ultimately means almost nothing. You got to do the practice. You can start with the Hool breath. If you're new and you don't know, do this. Go type in, you can type this in anywhere. The Hool breath, type that in anywhere. And you can see the video of me teaching you how to do that. Do that on a daily basis. If you can do that for an hour a day, I don't care if you are into conspiracy theories, you will still change. Your life will still get better, and you'll get something from a lot more from these videos. But lockdown.thunderwizard.com, $3,214 worth of video teachings. I'm giving it away, and the only thing that you're paying for are 5 personal services that you get from me, which can be done, which are only done through Skype. And that's all you're paying for. But the rest of it is literally $3,200 worth of stuff. Thunderwizard.com is my subscription channel. I recommend you going there because I give you specific techniques that I don't give on the free channel. A lot of specific stuff is on the free channel, but if you really want to go deep, go there. And even if you subscribe at the $25 level, you will learn the mastery of shamanism. I tell you everything that I can possibly think of to teach you about how to be a shaman, ceremony, ritual, energy work, runes, all that stuff. $25 a month will get you access to all of that, and I guarantee you will not get through all of it in 1 month, guaranteed. But if you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. And there are other levels too. You can subscribe at higher levels. This is what gives me the ability to do this, to stay on this channel and keep making these videos. Courses.thunderwizard.com is everything that I have, like books and other things, but most of it is here in the lockdown package. Of course, subscribe and hit the bell button. And you can check out my other channel if you want. If you are familiar with this, I have a channel called, I forget, it's Surviving BP, something like that. I forgot the name of it. But it's dealing with borderline personality disorder and how to survive being in a really toxic relationship. I've got a whole channel about that. You can go check that out. All right, so that's it. That's all the business I've been done. If there aren't any more questions, I'll go ahead and look at it. So Activist is laughing his ass off, which is always a good thing. You know, whenever you want to disagree with somebody, one of the best ways to win an argument is to laugh at them, because there's nothing like trying to demoralize somebody or humiliate them to, you know, get them to see your way. So Activist is doing a really great way of defending his position by laughing his ass off at me. And I got to tell you, the actual, you know, deep humiliation and desire to get him to approve of me is now so strong that I'm going to respond. He says, I study herbalism, aromatherapy, alchemy, astrology, cosmic laws. And what's your point? That somehow makes you immune to your unconscious emotional agendas? That makes you immune to your blind spots? You know, because I responded to you saying, what did you say? I forget what you said. Something that I found kind of stupid. But I don't know if you were talking to me. Was that you? There was somebody else. There was 2 of you. Yeah. I don't believe in government fear-mongering propaganda. That's such a huge statement. Be specific. Just because you study alchemy and astrology and cosmic laws doesn't mean that you understand what the government is doing. Just because you have a blanket fear of anybody in authority doesn't mean that it's the truth. Wake the fuck up. You're doing all that? Learn how to do critical thinking. I take offense at that. So you're equating spirituality with just being afraid of the government. You vote for Trump? Do you not believe in global warming? Are you a flat earther? There's a lot of really stupid, uneducated people who happen to believe in herbalism, aromatherapy, alchemy, and astrology. I love all that stuff. I like that stuff too. But I also like books. I also like critical thinking, which is knowing the difference between my own emotions skewing my beliefs. I'm also able to tell the difference between wanting to go with the flow and be like everybody else and taking a look at reality. So laugh your ass off all you want. And I'm glad you're probably a great astrologer and herbalist and aromatherapist and whatever else. I don't see how that argument means that somehow you're smart. And when it comes to not trusting government, fear-mongering, it's just, God, it just reeks of ignorance and naivete. It just reeks of what a child does who hasn't put the time and effort into actually, let's talk about research. People say, do your research. Whenever they say that to me, what they mean is, watch the videos that I watch. Like somehow if I watch enough of your videos, I'm going to buy into your belief system. Research is when you don't have an agenda on the outcome. When your honest desire is to want to know the truth, regardless of how many people believe something. If your need is to be part of the crowd, and if all the people that you hang out with all don't trust the government, and you want to be part of them and not trust the government, then you're not going to be able to figure out what crap the government is shoving down your throat and what crap the government isn't. You're not going to tell the difference between what is helpful for you and what's not, because you have an emotional agenda to be accepted by all the rest of the crowd. Or you've got a fear because you're uneducated, and because, not that you are or you aren't, but I promise you, for the most part, people who are into conspiracy theories are uneducated. They have not been to higher education. They haven't learned how to really learn how to think critically. So, real research is looking at both sides. You have an agenda, I do too. Everybody has one. There's a belief that you want to hold on to, I do too. So does everybody else. But if you really want to know the truth, you're willing to put yours aside and listen to the other side and see if they make sense. I did that. I was a 9/11 truther until one day I realized that I hadn't done any research into the opposing viewpoint. I was going on and watching the documentaries, I was watching all the stuff, and I was listening to all of the seemingly incontrovertible evidence that said that 9/11 was a hoax, and it made perfect sense to me. I totally believe in the industrial complex that's out there. I totally believe that the government was filled with people who had an agenda to take over the oil fields, and that this would have been the perfect thing to do, to create this fake thing so that we could go and conquer the Middle East and take their oil. I still think that makes perfect sense to me. And emotionally, I really wanted to buy into it until I went, hey, I've never even looked at the other side. So I went onto YouTube and I just typed in 9/11 truther debunked. And lo and behold, there were scientists and there were people on all levels of society explaining why the buildings fell the way that they did. One of the biggest ones that was, that people say, well, what about the one building that wasn't hit? It still went down. That proves there was an explosive charge. Actually, that's not what happened. From the front, you don't see anything, but from the back, what ends up happening is the building next to it fell, and the debris, the bricks and everything went and knocked out the whole back of the building and started a fire. But unless you actually put the effort to research it, you don't know that. And unless you listen to scientists and people talking about, airplane fuel and how airplanes explode and how those particular buildings were made and why they fell the way that they did, you understand that it makes perfect sense. And then you come to the realization, when you don't have an emotional attachment to the end result, you end up with the realization that that Occam's razor in this case works, in that the way it looks is the way it was. You had a group of people led by Osama bin Laden who had been trained by the West. He knew everything about the West. He knew how the West was going to respond. And he was a nutbag, and he had his own take about things and his own issues, and he tried to start a war so that the Western world, especially the United States, would go to war against all of Islam, so that all of Islam would rise up and overthrow the United States. And he got part of his wish because we did exactly what he was planning to do. And he says it. We've got him on video saying it. He says why he did it. And because I was willing to put my emotional agenda aside and look at the other side of the truth, I dropped my 9/11 truther to the chagrin of all of my friends, including my own teacher. My own teacher's a 9/11 truther. But I'm more interested in knowing the objective truth than having you approve of me. So you can laugh your ass off all you want. That isn't going to make me want to see things your way at all. It's going to only make me think that, you're buying into the whole nonsense here. All right, so I've stirred up a hornet's nest. Let's see if there's some questions here. Question, what does the personal God mean in our Vedic chart? What do you mean? So in Vedic astrology, as I give readings, there are 3 deities. There's the Ishta Devata, there's the Palana Devata, and the Dharma Devata. Ishta is your conscious mind, which would be the best corollary to what you wrote there. What does the personal God mean in our Vedic chart? The Ishta Devata is the deity that has chosen you, that you can talk to during the day, because it's your conscious mind. Communicate on a conscious level. Let's see. I wasn't arguing with you. I do think for myself, no, I'm a water protector in Canada. All right. Well, okay. So you pushed my buttons and I went off. My apologies if I saw you wrong. Anyway. Let's see. CRA question. What is the best physical exercise to prepare your body for the Hool breath? The best physical exercise to prepare your body for the Hool breath is the Hool breath. I love these kinds of questions. What is the best exercise? People want to ask me that. What is the most powerful Qigong? What is the best physical exercise? So I kind of don't understand the question. You can do it sitting down. It doesn't need a lot of physical strength, but I guess if you wanted to, you could learn how to do a jong, which is a standing posture. And I teach you how to do that somewhere on the channel. I teach you how to do that in my book, The Thunder Wizard Path. But those would be good exercises. Learn how to do I teach you how to do the world tree posture. That's all in my book, The Thunder Wizard Path. I think it's that. The Path of the Thunder Wizard, The Thunder Wizard Path, one of those two. Thunder Wizard Path. If you want to get that book, you can go, and I've got pictures and all that kind of stuff, and I teach you how to do that. So jongs, standing postures, are good practice for any Qigong or breath work. Zach Johnson wants to marry me. I'm assuming Zach is a male. Well, I happen to be pretty far on the spectrum of heterosexuality, so it probably wouldn't work out, but I appreciate it. CRA question. Oh, that was the one already. CRA, yoga is meant to prepare the body for the mantras. Figured there was a specific exercise to your path. Yoga, yeah. In case anybody doesn't know, yoga is only one thing. One of the ways that we Westerners have screwed things up is, all of the yoga studios you see and all the different yoga schools fighting with each other about which is the best yoga. It's all hatha yoga. All of it. It's all hatha yoga. And hatha yoga was just the preliminary to open up the nerves and the meridians so that you could do the higher stuff and do the mantras and balance the right and the left side, the sun and the moon, the male and female, so that you could do mantras more effectively. And people get all bent out of shape about getting everything perfectly right, and it was like, that's not what that was about. And just because some Westerner went over to India and said, I want to learn yoga, which means the path of truth, and the first one is to learn hatha yoga. And after learning hatha yoga for a while, they said, okay, I learned yoga, and they went back to the States, and yogis are like, that was only the first part. Westerners. All right, I don't see any more questions here. I went off the rails, and I got upset at somebody who, I have to say that remark, throwing out those kind of remarks that are so popular now, I mean, that's such a popular thing to say. I mean, let's be honest. What was her name? What was her name? That she retracted her message, I guess. Yeah, so that was it just comes across so cavalier, and people, especially, it's not really anybody's fault, but the way these these question and answer on YouTube, everybody wants to say, state who they are and what they're connected to and what their opinion is, and they throw it out with such cavalierness, and to just cavalierly throw that out, like such a blanket statement like that, which comes across as, I don't want to listen to anything anybody in authority has to say at any time. And any warning is fear-mongering. I mean, it bothers me. I wish people spent more time really looking at what they thought and what they believed and what they said. It just the whole internet culture of the dumbing down that comes with the internet and wanting to be a part of a group and all of that stuff, and overgeneralizing everything. It bothers me. It bothers me because I care, and I care for where the world is going to go, and if we're going to do something about making the world a better place, we got to stop doing that kind of shit. We got to stop being sheep, and we got to stop reacting out of our need to rebel or our need to belong, or we got to get smarter than that. We got to grow up. So I'm sorry that you happen to be on the end of that. You probably had no intention of being that. You probably thought that I was going to agree with you. But I think it's important, and I would really like to have something to do to help with that. And I got to be honest with you, I'm kind of frustrated. I'm frustrated with this channel. I'm disappointed because it's just sort of reached a plateau and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And I can't seem to get more than 500 views unless I do something really outrageous and clickbaity. If I like this, watch this video probably will get almost no views. And it's disconcerting, it's disillusioning. And I'd really like to see people want to care about the deep stuff and really want to learn the deep stuff. So anyway, I'm sure I'll figure out how to do that. I'm not giving up on this channel by any means, but that is kind of where I'm at. All right, so we'll see what goes on later. I don't see any more questions here. I'm obviously getting tired and cranky. I need a nap. So I'm going to just see you guys later. So, all right, there'll be more coming. There'll be a version 4 or whatever, part 4 of Awakening Sleipnir. And I'm sure I will have something else to say. I'll climb upon my soapbox and I'll have something else to complain about. All right, that's it, guys. I'll see you guys later.